And thank you so much, all of you, for being here. This is Women's History Month. And so we are acknowledging one of the finest women, one of the most distinguished lawyers, one of the most distinguished jurists here in the Eastern District of Michigan. The Global Conversation Speaker Series here has had, in the past, noted individuals appear on this stage. And this morning we are talking to Federal Judge Victoria Roberts. And I want to say that I do recognize that federal judges hardly give interviews, so I don't know how I was able to convince her to be on the stage here this morning. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I feel like this is a reunion. The last time we were here was about 8 years ago. The push for racial diversity on the jury pool in the federal court, with yourself, Judge Dennis Page Hood, then Chief Judge Rosen, Bravo McQuaid, former U.S. Attorney, I think Mariam Schiffer, who was a former chief defender, were all on the stage having that conversation. But to begin this discussion, how women have shaped the federal judiciary, their role, contribution, and influence through your own life story, I think perhaps a more appropriate point of departure for this conversation would be to ask you to tell us what got you into the law. Why did you go to law school?
I went to law school quite by accident, actually, Bankole. Had life gone a different way, I might have been in your seat rather than in this seat, because I aspired to be a journalist. I majored in journalism at the University of Michigan. I fully intended, I had spent my short life up to then doing a lot of writing of plays and short stories and poetry. I spent a summer, actually 2 summers at the Michigan Chronicle, where you were, writing short articles for that paper. So it was my dream. It was my dream to be a journalist. The fall of my senior year, which was 1972 at the University of Michigan, I talked to the head of the journalism department. I told him what I wanted to do. He said that he could help me get a position, probably. But the only offer he gave me, and I'm not diminishing it at all, was with Johnson Publications. So if all of you are familiar with Ebony and Jet and other magazines, Johnson Publishing House published those magazines. That was the only help he offered me. And I was not interested in leaving Michigan. I would have had to go to Chicago. And so I stayed here and I tried to make my way with our local papers at the time, the Detroit News and Detroit Free Press. I had an interview with the Detroit News in the fall of 1972. I brought my portfolio. I brought many of the things that I had been interested in and that I wrote about. And the editor of the Detroit News said to me, and this is a quote, "You have a great portfolio, but we just hired a Black reporter." So that was really my first exposure to that kind of blatant and direct discrimination as a Black person. It's happened again. It's happened to me because I'm a woman, but that was the first. Well, maybe it was the second, because Dr. Porter steered me only to Johnson Publication. And I didn't think about it as steering at the time. I didn't think about how he was foreclosing me as opposed to some of the other journalist students that he was helping out. So that's what I was told. And I left the Detroit News office in tears, literally in tears. I had been driven there by someone who would become my husband. We weren't even engaged then, but he was in law school. And I get in the car, I'm bawling. He's in his first year of law school at Wayne State University. I told him what happened, and he said, "You should go to law school to fight this kind of injustice." And that was the beginning. I had had a thought before then of going to law school, and I started applying, and I got in.
Quite a story. We're still in a long walk to freedom. And I think, media diversity remains a big issue to this day, especially in the national reckoning on racial justice and Black Lives Matter. But that's very instructive because, interestingly, I'm just reading In fact, I've started reading 3 weeks ago John Johnson's biography, Succeeding Against All Odds. But let's go to the bench. So that inspiration or that incident motivated you to go to law school. What was your reaction when it became clear in 1998, after your nomination by President Clinton, that you were going to be a federal judge?
I think that was another instance when along my entire career, which began as a lawyer in 1976, where I simply had to pinch myself because I didn't expect that anything like that would ever happen to me. My background is blue collar. My parents didn't finish high school. My mother went back and got a GED when she was in her 40s. She did domestic work. She did ironing. She did laundry for people in the neighborhood. It was not what I expected. And in fact, I probably had very few expectations about how my life would unfold because I hadn't had a lot of exposure to professional people. When I was in law school, I had attempted to get a job as an intern, a law clerk, as a law clerk. I had one of my law clerks right here, Alyssa Gordon. Hi, Alyssa. But I had tried to get a job doing what Alyssa is doing for me. I applied to federal judges in Michigan. Again, I wanted to return to Michigan. I was in Boston in law school at the time. And I got one interview. It was with Wade McCree. Many of you have probably heard that name. By then, he was on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Wade was very blue blood, Harvard Law, and he extended this interview to me because he said he was intrigued by my application, by my law school, which was Northeastern, not top 10. We didn't have grades. We had extensive written evaluations from all of the professors. And there was a year that we had to spend interning in order to graduate. So a very different setup. And Judge McCree said he was intrigued. So I have an interview with him. And at the end, he said, you're great, but he said, I usually hire from Harvard and Yale and Michigan. So I'm not going to extend an offer to you. But he made a phone call to his son-in-law, who had just started a law firm, and asked his son-in-law if he could use me. And that was how my first job began. Because after that interview with Judge McCree, I didn't have a plan. And I'm graduating from law school. I didn't know what I was going to do. So that door opened up. And I say all that to say that the experience of not being able to get a job as a law clerk because I didn't have the right credentials, I wasn't the right pedigree, I think stuck with me over my entire career. And so when the possibility of becoming a federal judge, not just a law clerk, but a federal judge opened up to me, I didn't think it was going to be possible. And I actually was not the one who pursued it. There were other people in my sphere, Judge Julian Cook for one, Judge Anna Dix Taylor for another. They were the ones who pushed my application. Judge Cook is the one who first called me and asked me if I was going to apply for one of 3 vacancies. And I told him no. And I told him this experience and said, I'm not going to get it, Judge Cook. Why would I put myself through all of that pain? And I didn't do it. An application period was open for about 3 months. I didn't submit my application. Judge Cook kept calling me. Judge Taylor called me. And finally, on the a week before, Judge Cook actually had one of his law clerks bring me the application papers. I hadn't got them myself. And the very last day that it was due, my secretary came and said, we should do this. We should do this. And I don't know to this day how Linda and I were able to put together that kind of application that was required for that position. But it was December 31st. It was New Year's Eve. It was 1996. And I was walking my application over to Eugene Dreiker's office at 4:45 to meet that 5 o'clock deadline. So when all of it unfolded and I finally know that I am going to be a federal judge, I can't even say it was a dream come true because I never dreamt that dream. I don't think I didn't have enough to dream that dream.
It's a very fascinating story because your background, one would argue, stands disruptive to the typical pedigree, as you said. It's the counter. It's not the normal requisite and so forth. Coming from that unlikely background, I'm curious, how has that been able to influence what you do on the bench? Because yours was not the usual, background.
I think my background is more akin to the criminal defendants, particularly that we see, than the backgrounds of the judges who have the Ivy Leagues and the intact families and all of the opportunities extended to them. So I say that to say that I think that it has really helped me to empathize with a number of the people who appear in front of me, because I've had, and in my family, I've had so many of the experiences that bring them in front of me to be sent to prison. So sentencing is one of the hardest things that I do. And I have a deep appreciation for our communities and how we have to immunize ourselves from criminal activity. But on the other hand, the criminals fit a profile. They fit a profile. They have the same kind of broken backgrounds. They didn't finish school. Their fathers are in prison, if they even knew their fathers. Their mothers were drug addicts. They were sexually abused. They were beaten. They can't read. I can sympathize with all of that. They have substance abuse. They have mental illness. I can sympathize with all of that. And it doesn't mean that they get a break, but it does mean that their entire person is considered in the sentencing process, as we are required to do. We are required to not just consider the crime. We're required to consider the criminal, the family the criminal comes from, the children that are going to be left behind, what happens to them, the community that they're leaving, the community they're putting a hole in. So I think that it has helped me be a better judge because of the background that I've come from.
And I wanna come into that, dig into that a little bit more, but I still want to stay with the question I asked her, because this unlikely background of yours, not the typical pedigree as you emphasized here this morning, how did you feel when you knew that as a federal judge, with a stroke of a pen, you can alter the lives of people? You can have the White House backtrack on a program. You can hold an entire state hostage based on your decision. Did you reflect on that at the time? On the significance of being, at the highest levels of the judicial?
I certainly appreciated the magnitude of the stroke of a pen of a federal judge. From having been in law school, we read cases endlessly. We read cases not only out of the districts like this district and this appeals area, but from the Supreme Court, which is the law of the land. And I knew from being in law school that the judiciary was such an important but often overlooked branch of government. I think with some of the more recent fights about who's going to get on the Supreme Court, that the impact of the Supreme Court and those decisions have become much more widely known to people. People appreciate what the Supreme Court can do. But I think that's a fairly recent development. So I knew from law school the power of that pen. I didn't think that I would ever be holding that pen and exerting that kind of power, but I certainly knew how I was going to be able to influence. And it's very sobering, and makes it all the more important for us to get judges on the bench, to have judges on the bench who have integrity and who are not going to abuse that power. That power is just it's just endless. And we have to have the right people there.
And I also think, and I want to come to your accomplishments in African American women in the federal bench, but I think also one of the most perhaps enduring examples of the power of the judiciary is the fact that the civil rights movement, the battles that have been fought, had to be adjudicated in court, and which of course underscores the essence of the judiciary. Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, and others had to go to court to plead the case of Black folk.
Absolutely. Constance Baker Motley certainly comes to mind in this Women's History Month.
Yes.
Constance Baker actually wrote the first draft of Brown versus Board of Education, that complaint, and she doesn't get credit for having done that. Yeah. Thurgood Marshall gets all the credit. Yeah. Constance Baker Motley argued 10 cases in the United States Supreme Court before she was appointed to the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson. She won 9 of those cases. She represented James Meredith, who was trying to get into the University of Mississippi. That was one of her cases. And I read a biography about her as well. And one of the things she said was that in the civil rights movement, which was dominated by Black men, they sent her and they sent other women to the South because they thought they had less of a chance of being harmed. So the women were put on the forefront to go into the South and, engage in those skirmishes on the ground.
Right.
She even went to, I believe, Atlanta and represented
Dr. King.
Dr. King.
Yeah, King was a client of hers.
Exactly. So Constance Baker Motley, as well as so many other women, were on the ground and were doing that work, that kind of legwork, back and laying the groundwork for people like me. I think Justice Ketanji Jackson said that Constance Baker Motley was the role model that she looked up to. Constance Baker knew when she was 15 that she wanted to be a lawyer. I think Ketanji Jackson knew at a young age she wanted to be a lawyer. Our Stephanie Dawkins Davis, who just went up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, knew when she was a kid that she wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't in their camp. Those are all great women, but they were focused. They are great women, and they were focused and knew exactly what they wanted to do and did it.
So I looked at the numbers in writing my Detroit News column about you. I looked at the numbers, and you shared some of that with me about the number of Black federal judges around the country. 11%, and 38% of those are women, Black women. So, and you're part of that 38%. Let's talk about what you see as some of perhaps your most instructive moments on the federal bench here in the Eastern District.
I think that in this age when we're talking about diversity and people are trying to minimize the need for diversity and equity and inclusion, I think one of my most instructive moments has been just interacting with the judges who do come from backgrounds that are incredibly different from mine. And the kinds of interactions that we have had that have been able to influence the thinking of everybody in the room. A good example of that is we have something called the Sentencing Council, and 3 judges will gather after having read the sentencing papers for all 3 of those judges and make some recommendations. One judge might be at the top of the guidelines. Another judge might be at the bottom of the guidelines. Somebody else might be in the middle. But it is those kinds of discussions that help influence the outcome. On the district court, judges work solo. Court of Appeals, it has to be a majority. Supreme Court, it has to be a majority. So on my bench, it's not as important to have those discussions that will influence the thinking of others, but they're so critical. They're so critical. So I think that just appreciating the importance of that kind of interaction has influenced much of what I have done on the bench. Another moment for me has been just realizing the importance of pro se people who are in courts, who don't have a lawyer, who can't get a lawyer. And that is a pretty high percentage of people who come into federal court who think that they can represent themselves. And as a result of that, I got our court to agree to begin a pro se clinic. We do that now in conjunction with the University of Detroit Mercy. There's a professor there who mans that clinic. Students man that clinic. It's housed at the federal court. And so now we are engaged in providing not nearly as much as we need, but providing services for people who are unrepresented in court. We've done that. Thank you. We've done that on the criminal side for a long time. We've said criminal defendants have an absolute right to be represented by a lawyer. That hasn't happened on the civil side, but things like our pro se clinic get us there, to having people have that kind of representation so that they can maneuver the very complicated court system. So those are two things, I think. The jury issue that you talked about, we are very interested in diversity within the ranks of judges, but we're also interested in diversity in the ranks of jurors. And when you understand the importance of that, then you understand why the bench needs to be diverse as well. Any lawyers in this room will know, who's done a jury selection, knows that they are going through person after person after person to get the right person on that jury, to get the right mix of people who can come together and make a unanimous decision. And so examining why I would be on the bench and I have 60 people coming through the back door for jury service and not one of those faces is Black was very disconcerting to me. And that's why Judge Hood and I began that committee to look at what was going on jury service.
And how has it been with the jury diversification?
Well, we're seeing some improvement, not nearly the kind of improvement that would make our jurors representative of the Eastern District of Michigan population, but we're seeing other minorities coming in as well. When we decided to examine this issue, it was after the court had been sued several times, and people were saying that the court was engaging in systemic discrimination to keep Blacks off the jury. And Judge Cook had one of those cases, had tried to put a fix in place. That fix was struck down by the Sixth Circuit. I had one of those cases. I looked at all the evidence and decided that there wasn't evidence of systemic discrimination, but there certainly were things we needed to do to make our juries more diverse. And that's when Judge Hood and I asked that committee be formed, and we started examining it. What we found out was that in the Black community, primarily in Detroit, summonses were being delivered and being thrown in the wastebasket. They just weren't being responded to. We also know the big problem of blight in this city. And so summonses were being delivered to homes that didn't even exist. And they were just, on the ground. So it was things like that rather than something systemic that we were doing.
Right.
And we found out that jury service in large part is an education process. And we took our dog and pony show on the road here and to a lot of other places just to emphasize the importance of jury service and to convince people how important it is. People come into court kicking and screaming. They're trying to get off of juries all the time. And I will say that at the very beginning. I know the stories. Don't make up anything to me. We're going to see through it. We're going to come after you if you've told me something. And so I think getting that kind of speech from me in the very beginning has prevented people from trying to get off. And invariably, when we conduct interviews post-trial, everyone is heartened. They feel that they've made a contribution, and they've come together with strangers and made a unanimous decision. It's quite remarkable.
But is there, let me play a devil's advocate here. Is there a recognition, though, even in that process, that the court system is in itself intimidating? Just the court system. the federal court system is even more intimidating?
I think it's intimidating for everyone. It's intimidating for young lawyers who come in and have never tried a case or haven't seen anybody quite like me or other judges on the bench. It's intimidating for them. I think people who try to get out of jury service are intimidated by the process. They believe that it's going to take much more out of them than they have to give. And I think that part of our obligation is to demystify the court. I think that there's much more that we can do in the Eastern District to open the doors of that courthouse to the community, to sponsor community events. Every May we have Law Day, and we have hundreds of people who show up to the court Law Day to try to find out about what we're doing. And I think that we should have many, many more forums like that. We hold naturalization ceremonies at the courthouse 2 or 3 times a week. A number of people, new citizens, come into that courthouse building. And I think all of the judges who participate in that try to educate them about the judiciary and the role that they can play now that they're new citizens, if they do get summonses to come in and serve on a jury. But a lot of times people throw those things away, the summonses away, because there's a language barrier, for example. We have just started seeing a number of people of Arab descent who are coming in, and they'll say they struggle with the language. And so in fairness to the litigants, I think you have to have people on the jury who understand English and who speak it well, who can communicate in that jury room. But language barriers also prevent people from responding to the summonses and coming in and doing what they can.
So looking at the court system itself, as an African-American woman judge on the federal bench, what can you say about the fact that there's a need to have more women judges? And of course, I might add, more African-American women judges on the bench. Are you concerned? I mean, is there something that worries you? Do you feel that there's an effort within the court itself to do so, to move the needle, to open it more, to have more Victoria Roberts on the bench?
There certainly is an effort. I think that women didn't start coming into the profession in droves until the 1970s, and that has continued. When I started practicing law, when I was president of the Wolverine Bar Association, when we published the Red Book, that was the history of Black lawyers in Michigan from 1844 to 1970. In 1970, when we published that book, there were only 300 Black women lawyers practicing in the state of Michigan. There were only 1,000 Black lawyers total in the state. And so it was... to say that it was a lonely place to be practicing law is an understatement, because I wasn't seeing people who looked like me. I think now, fast forward from 1970 to 2023, women are half of the population in law schools, right, Alyssa? Yeah. So that's major. That is a major difference and so there is a critical mass of women lawyers that presidents can choose from to elevate to the bench. And so much of who gets appointed to the bench does depend on who is in power, but that's another discussion.
Well, yeah, and I was frankly surprised when I saw that you were the 62nd president of the state bar and the only Black woman ever.
Is that a question? That is a true statement. Yes.
Yeah. So let's move it. I want to talk about just building the next generation of judges and lawyers. But before that, let's take a tour around the globe. You've traveled from Kenya to Kuala Lumpur and so forth, giving lectures. Talk about those experiences, though, and what you feel those experiences have brought for the bench.
All of those programs that I have participated in were sponsored by the State Department, the Department of Justice, the Federal Judicial Center, by some branch of the executive branch of government or the judicial branch of government. And these programs have been held around the globe because the United States identifies countries that are friendly, countries that are emerging democracies, countries that believe they want their judicial system to look like ours. And I think as a model, it's a great model. It doesn't always work the way that it's supposed to, but it is a great model. And there are a number of countries who want to model themselves after us. So I have been asked by those branches of government and those agencies to participate in what we call rule of law programs to spread democracy, to spread this judicial system across the world. But it's been at the invitation also. We're not just going over there and telling them that this is what they have to do. So two of the...
No, go ahead.
One program in particular that stands out to me was one that I did in Kenya in 2009. And it was, there was new legislation that had been proposed that was the Violence Against Women Act. The first time, this is 2008, 2009, and Kenya did not have a law that addressed violence against women. Also in Kenya, police were the same police who might do an arrest was also the prosecutor in a case. And so men were simply not being held responsible at all for any acts of domestic violence. Rape could not be committed in a marriage. We know that can still happen when people are married. So that was something that was being addressed in that legislation. There was a lot of opposition to it. We went there. We had a crew of judges and lawyers who went there to do training on that act to help lawyers prosecute these kinds of cases if this legislation was going to go into place. And so we were there for an entire week and ran this training with Kenyan lawyers, Kenyan judges. An interesting story to tell because I don't know what is going on there now, but when I went to Kenya, I had my hair in dreadlocks and it was quite long. And at the end of the program, that Saturday, we had a wrap up and questions. And question from the audience, a young woman asked me if I could, she said, "Can you wear your hair like that to court?" And now I'm a judge. I want to say I can do whatever I want to do. I'm the judge. But she said, "Can you wear your hair like that to court?" And what really I didn't know where that was coming from, except that I recognized that all of the Kenyan women in that room had straight hair, had weaves, had straight hair, had wigs on. And they could not. It was against the law for them to go into court with natural hair. Yeah. I don't know if that's changed. I certainly hope that it has, but they could not go into court.
So that leads me to a Cold War question, Judge Roberts. Many of the nations around the world know about the racial struggles in the United States. I was reading a biography by the life of the late first Black congressman from Ohio, Louis Stokes. And in the book, it's called The Gentleman from Ohio. And Congressman Stokes chaired the subcommittee on the assassination of Dr. King, as well as President John F. Kennedy. And in the book, he cites during the height of the Congressional Black Caucus's power in the 70s, when the late Congressman Charles Dix was one of the founders of the caucus, and they were seeking a meeting with Richard Nixon. And President Nixon would not give them a meeting, and they had agreed to do a press conference and let the whole world know that Richard Nixon would not meet with the Congressional Black Caucus. And he indicated in the book, The Gentleman from Ohio, that the only reason why Nixon gave the meeting was because Russia was getting ready to propagandize and say, look at the United States, they're not even meeting with their members, Black members of Congress. So with that backdrop, I flip the question this way to you. As an African-American woman going around the world and giving lectures in nations that know of our own racial struggles here, did some of the questions that were put to you, or did they pull you by the side and ask you just about your own experience as an African-American woman? Did those come up?
Oh, yes. Yes, very personal questions were asked about how I got to become a judge in the first place. And they were very curious about, some of the same things that I've disclosed here about how such a thing can happen. Because the experience in other countries, I think for a lot of Black women, is that they are still discriminated against. We have a double whammy. When I was at the University of Michigan in the late 60s, early 70s, was the beginning of the Black movement, the Black student movement. And it also was the beginning of the gender movement. And I had such a hard time trying to figure out where my loyalties were going to be, because with respect to the Black student movement, that was very male dominated, and we got the discrimination based on sex. And then, when I went to the meeting of the women, I think that they were regarded as having many things in tandem with the Black student movement, but also there were many things that put us in tension. So I think things like that are part of people's curiosity. Just how do you move across those two lines as a Black woman when you've got the possibility of being discriminated against for two reasons rather than only one?
Yeah, and I'm going to open this to questions from our audience here. But let me also ask you this question, two more questions before we go to the audience. If you were to lead your life all over again, would you choose this path of going to law school, practicing law, private practice, ends up getting nominated to the federal bench and being here talking to us this morning?
I've had a great life. It's been a great run. It certainly was not it wasn't the life that I envisioned for myself, but I don't know that I knew enough to really plan out what I wanted my law career to look like. There are people who know that. They know what they want to do when they're 6 years old, and they do it. I never did. And all of the positions that I had were positions that I worked exceedingly hard in all of the positions I had as a lawyer. But many times that door was open to me, not because I was going after that, but because someone presented it to me as a possibility. I could say that about every job that I had. So I wasn't wedded to one practice of the law, one particular area of the law. I remember when I was in my mid-40s, I had so many jobs. I just said to myself, Roberts, you need to stay at a place long enough so that your pension can vest, because I wasn't vesting anywhere. I had that many. But the opportunities presented themselves. I did well at everything, and it just sort of escalated. So would I rewrite my book at all? No. There were a number of setbacks. There were a number of things that for me were tragic. Would I rewrite my story? Not at all. Not at all.
So 11% of African Americans, the federal bench in this nation are Black people, 11%, 38% women. How do we increase that number? What do you think needs to happen to increase the number, to have more Black women in the federal bench?
I think the people who are making these decisions need to keep in the forefront that diversity on the bench in so many forms is so important, that you can't stop with where somebody is at law school. You can't stop with their grade point average. You then have to start just looking at the experiences of Black women and other people in this country and make a decision about the contribution that can be made by people with those kinds of backgrounds. And it's all kinds of backgrounds. So I think that the decision makers have to have that first and foremost. And I know diversity, equity, inclusion is under attack. It's just under attack across this country. People want to just get rid of it as if it isn't something that matters. But, we look out at this room, we look at this spectrum, we look at the people who are here in attendance, and this is what our country looks like. And this is what our bench should look like.
What worries you most, though, in terms of the attack that we see on the notion of inclusion and diversity? What worries you most? What is the most concerning for you? Are we rolling back the clock? Or do you think that's an exaggeration?
I think that this is a moment in time when there are people who really do want to roll back the clock. And I think that it makes it all the more important for our younger people in the XYZ generations to step up. The baby boomers, what's your generation, Homer? The silent generation. We're at the backstretch now. And I was talking to someone about this the other day, about how the Wolverine Bar Association, for example, was so important to me when I came out, because that was the only way I was going to see other people of color. I went to women lawyers meetings because that was the only way I was going to see and engage with other women. We don't have that kind of need for those organizations anymore because it's so easy to outreach and make those kinds of connections. But there are organizations, I would tell the young lawyers, you still have to get involved in organizations like the Wolverine Bar Association, who will write the history of Black lawyers in Michigan, who can still open those doors. There were people opened doors for me. That's the only reason I'm sitting here. And I think younger people have to appreciate all of those doors that got open and how much this struggle has to continue, or those doors are going to close. And you all need to do it. The young people need to do it.
And this goes to my one more question. We'll open this discussion to the audience here. It goes to this question because I've never, asked the federal judge that question. We are in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw what happened with George Floyd. We saw what happened with Tyree Nichols. Ed Manco's the latest case. We saw what happened with Patrick Leoya in Grand Rapids. Of course, some of these cases are still being litigated. But, as you sit on top of the judiciary, as you sit on the judiciary, an entity that is charged with, enforcing or interpreting the essence of constitutional policing and so forth. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on these issues that are boiling to the top, and some of them, are making it to federal court.
I think the Black Lives Matters headline is an important one, and it is a nice bucket, if you will, in which a lot of things can go. I want to just go back one moment to my story when I tried to become a journalist, and I was told that we just hired a Black reporter, and that was a very proud statement. And what it pointed out was that back then and earlier, and even after that, there were quotas of one or there were quotas of none. And so I am offended when people say that there wasn't and there isn't a place for affirmative action. Because when there were quotas of 0 and when there were quotas of 1, there were so many opportunities that we got left out on. And that has to be remedied. And it's not going to be remedied in one generation. So many white people have inherited wealth, for example. My generation, baby boomer, my generation of Black professionals is really the first generation in mass that will have some kind of wealth to pass on to our children and our grandchildren. But white people in this country have had generations of being able to pass on that kind of wealth. And we're just getting there. So when I think about quotas of none and quotas of 1 and people having their land taken away from them, Native Americans, we are so far behind. We are so far behind, and Black Lives Matters, I think, helps keep that in the forefront. They do matter.
So you've opened a can of worms, Judge Roberts, on this issue. I got one more question, and I promise I'll go to the audience after this. But she just opened a can of worms. So I'm thinking, as you're speaking, the movement for the modern reparatory justice, the late Conrad Warrior, Sir Hilary Beckles, leading global scholar who was a vice chancellor of the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean. Dr. King went to the Mona campus in the 60s and gave the convocation at the West Indies. Sir Hilary Beckles gave a lecture at Harvard in 2015 or 2016, making the case for reparatory justice. And he makes a compelling case. And this issue has gotten a lot of attention. We're in that moment now. I'm just curious about Judge Roberts' take on this national conversation on reparatory justice.
I think there's a place for reparations. I'm not quite sure what it should look like. But for all the reasons I already stated, because we have just generations of discrimination and generations of wealth never accumulated. And that's why we have the kinds of people with the backgrounds that we have in my court appearing there. There's so much to be made up for. We have such a hole in our communities and in our families because of this generational pain and generational trauma. That's real. That's real. And how it gets addressed, how it gets remedied, how it gets fixed, I'm not quite sure. But I think that there is a place for reparations.
All right. From the eminent federal judge, Victoria Roberts, we're going to open this to the audience. And I always try to crave the indulgence of our audience members. If you have a question, please let's go straight to the question. Who wants to fire the first question for Judge Roberts? Should I start with former Detroit City Councilwoman, Dr. Joanne Watson?
I'm so happy to follow. Now, first of all, I want to commend the smartest woman in the University of Michigan when I was there. That was Victoria Roberts.
She exaggerates. She was.
Thank you for standing up for reparatory justice. Thank you for honoring these sacrifices of our people, because we built this country, and it is never acknowledged. We built this country. And even in a place like Detroit, which is not typically seen as a place that dealt with enslavement, Detroit did. It was enslaved people who put steeples on every Catholic church in this city. It's the names of enslavers that are broadcast on our streets. Like Jefferson, who was a pedophile and an enslaver. So I want to commend Wayne County Community College District for honoring Women's History Month by having the Honorable Victoria Roberts as our keynote speaker today.
Thank you, Joanne. And I want to, before you go to another question, Joanne just prompted me I cut this out of the New York Times yesterday. I don't know if anybody else saw it. A full-page article on Stephanie Johnson Wright. Stephanie Johnson Wright was a United States, Assistant United States Attorney in the Northern District of Iowa from 1994 to 2018. And a group associated with the court, that the Historical Society at the court put together a book that listed all of the assistant United States attorneys from the Northern District of Iowa who had ever practiced in that court. And Stephanie Johnson Wright was left out of that book. She was the only Black AUSA in the Northern District of Iowa from that period of time, 1994 to 2018. She was left out of the book. And she took steps to try to correct that. One of the steps that she took was to pay for her own billboard during Black History Month in Iowa. She had her face on it. It said, Black History Month, Stephanie Johnson Wright, first African American United States Attorney in Northern District of Iowa. And she finally got the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals to put together a remedy, which was, there were only a few pages that would have to be corrected in that book. And the remedy was that they had to produce pages to paste over all of the copies of that book that were in circulation that corrected the record. But one of the things that Stephanie said was that she says, I'm like a hidden figure. I am the hidden figure of Northern District of Idaho, and I don't want to be that hidden figure. Somebody has to write the story, the history, and if we have to do it, if nobody else is going to do it, and we have to correct the record as she did.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we're correcting the record this morning here. Let's go. Who was the next question? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here with us and representing Albany. I love your story of really being your strength and coming up from the ranks on your own, self-made. I'm Dr. Tammy Anderson. I work at District Student Services. This is my 33rd year in education. But prior to that, I was an officer for 8 years in the city of Detroit. I love reparations. I practice as a principal, and I love it in law. What are your thoughts on where we draw the line when it relates to mental health or drug abuse and what's actually a crime? When should someone have to deal with the court system, and when should they be allowed to heal and be given the support through all of that healing, whether it's mental health, drug abuse, alcoholism, whatever it may be?
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. That is such a difficult issue to contend with. As many of you know, Michigan, a few administrations back, engaged in an all-out effort to close down many of the mental hospitals in the state. And it put a lot of people out on the street. And instead of having mental hospitals to treat the mental illness, they were put in prisons and in jails because they couldn't cope, and they resorted to criminal activity. So there's much more to it, but part of it is that we simply don't have the institutional resources available now to treat people with mental illness who do end up in the penal system. One of the things that the Sentencing Commission is doing at the federal level is taking a hard look at alternatives to incarceration and taking into account how mental illness factors into the decision, if you want to call it a decision, to commit a crime. We certainly haven't done enough. We don't have enough resources. When people come out of prison that we, on the federal level, have sentenced, they're usually under court supervision. And at the Eastern District of Michigan, we do have some resources to get people mental health treatment, mental health counseling. But I think that we have to do so much more on the front end to prevent them from going into prison in the first place. And that's just not happening. I put the failure to treat mental health issues in the same category that I put the failure to educate our kids, because if kids were being properly educated, they wouldn't become criminals. If they were being properly trained for jobs, they would not become criminals. So there are systemic things wrong in this country, and the penal system is used as the solution, and that shouldn't be the case.
So I want to switch the pendulum quickly before we take our next question. You played a vital role in the bankruptcy. You were one of the mediators, and certainly in also cases dealing with the unions as well, ASME and so forth. Can you just reflect on that process and how tedious it was for you?
Certainly. The city of Detroit, I think, filed for bankruptcy in July of 2013. And by November of 14, we had a fully adjudicated plan of adjustment. So in a year, in 15 months, Detroit was out of bankruptcy. The first thought when it went into bankruptcy was, how are we going to deal with all of these creditors when there is such a small pot of money and assets available to satisfy the creditors? Probably many of you know of the creditors wanted the Detroit Institute of Arts to sell the art in order to liquidate, to get funds to satisfy them. The Detroit Water was on the chopping block as well. So we had two assets. We had art and we had water. So that was going on the creditor side. The other side was that if Detroit is to emerge from bankruptcy and be the great city that it was decades ago, we have to have labor peace also, and we have to have a labor force that is engaged. Is that Rebecca Wasserman? Hi, Rebecca. Another former law clerk. We had to have a workforce that was fully engaged and able to perform the services that the citizens of Detroit needed once we were back on a good footing. And so I was tasked with the responsibility to negotiate all the labor contracts while the negotiations with the other creditors was going on. I was negotiating and in the end negotiated 45 collective bargaining agreements that gave us labor peace the same day that the plan of adjustment was entered by the bankruptcy court. And that labor peace came with all of our public service unions. I was negotiating with police and fire and sergeants and then just the public workers generally who are in AFSCME. But we were able to accomplish that in tandem with the negotiations with the creditors.
All right, let's go to the next question.
Good morning. How are you, Judge? All right, Mr. Thompson.
Oh, hi.
Mitchell.
Hi.
Quick question. I actually got 3 questions. As far as the future of former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, what do you think that should be? More importantly, you spoke about literature from 1844 to 1970. Could you speak about some stories about that collaboration and some stories about the individuals in that literature?
Yes. Okay. Well, I will not comment on Mayor Kilpatrick or his future. The Red Book, we call it the Red Book. It was a publication put out by the Wolverine Bar Association in 1997. It was written by Professor Edward Littlejohn, who is Professor Emeritus at Wayne State Law School. And he collaborated with Donald Hobson, who was a judge in our recorder's court. And Professor Littlejohn is simply a true scholar. His most recent book is one about George Crockett. It just came out. But Professor Littlejohn worked for years to put together the history of what was put into the Red Book. And I wish that we had some still available. We are out of print. But he just researched so many of the Black lawyers who started to practice in Michigan back in the 1870s, the lawyers who became the first judges, elected as well as appointed. And so it was a pretty detailed history of Black lawyers in Michigan from 1844 to 1970. And I understand that there's some people who are interested in telling the story forward. It hasn't been nothing put in paper yet, but that was it. That was the project. We sold the buddy. We raised money for the Wolverine Bar Association Foundation. And all of the money from that sale of that book went to fund scholarships through the Wolverine Bar Association.
Next question.
Good morning, Judge Roberts.
Good morning.
In your comments, you mentioned that doors and opportunities were open for you, and you did well. What you barely though touched upon is the reason that you did well is because of your efforts, your work, and maybe you can say something for the Spinnies and the rest of us about when the opportunities come, we do have to put forth.
Well, thank you very much. And Joanne, you've said this too. You have to be prepared for your opportunities. You say that. You've said that all the time. So we don't always know where those opportunities are going to come from, but we need to be prepared for them. And so I can say that while so many people opened doors for me, I think I was prepared for the opening of those doors. I just, I did all of my jobs. I did them well. I developed a good reputation. And so I think that when there was something to be, perhaps to be exploited and taken advantage of, I came to mind for people. That's what I can say. I came to mind and I was ready for it. So for the young people in the room, I can't tell you how important it is to just do everything that you're doing, to do it well and to treat people well along the way. When I was president of the State Bar of Michigan, the membership then was about 32,000 lawyers. I was across this entire state during that year. I think that opportunity to be president of the State Bar and that opportunity to touch so many people contributed to me getting nominated by President Clinton. I had just so many people who just came out of the woodwork who were prepared to help me, even when my nomination got in trouble at one point. I just had a lot of help. Judge Cook, I mentioned to him, there's an award in federal court that we award annually. It's called the Julian Cook Civility Award. And we put it in place because Judge Cook was just one of the kindest, most respectable people you could ever want to meet. And no one had anything bad to say about him, even though, he ruled against, he was just so respectful and kind. And I think that that's the kind of person that the young lawyers in the room should aspire to be. Someone just like that who knows the value of relationships and how important they can become, even 10 years later, 20 years later. You just don't know who you have touched, who you've treated well, who you've treated poorly, and how things may come back and bite you. But thank you for that.
Judge Roberts, thank you so much for sharing your fascinating background and your views. I want to know your views about the private prison system, that the peoples are making money of inmates and the government is obligated to provide them prisoners. Is that fair?
What I can say, I could talk about the prison system at the federal level. There is a debate about whether those prisons can be run more efficiently by the government or more efficiently by private industry. I think we have a lot of stories of failed prisons, failed exercises when prisons have been privatized. But we also have so many instances where they're still under the control of the government and they're failing people as well. So I think rather than the private versus public, the discussion really should be about what are we doing to prepare people who are in our penal system to come out and lead productive lives so that they do not resort again to crime. There is an effort within the prison system to engage in more job training for the prisoners. There is an effort to place them more or closer to their homes so that they are not separated from their families. I think we have figured out that having the ability to get visits and family and children to come is important to the rehabilitation. There's so many things that are wrong and that simply have not been addressed and should be addressed. So long as we are thinking about the penal system as being the end game, it's not going to function the way that it should, which is we can't even send people to rehabilitation cannot be a reason to send people to prison because there is recognition that people are really not rehabilitated in prison. So I can't say I'm going to send Mr. Carson to prison for 15 years for 15 months so he could take advantage of this job training program. I can't do that. I'll get reversed by the court, by the Sixth Circuit, if I said I'm doing it for that reason, because everybody knows that people do not get rehabilitated in prison. So rather than prisons all being just punitive, I think that we need to focus on how they really can prepare people for life after imprisonment.
All right, so we'll take 4 more questions before we round up this conversation.
Hello.
My name is Rajani Hampton. I can't really think of what my question is per se, but I have this thing that I'm working on, nonprofit called My City Eats Detroit.
Called what?
My City Eats Detroit. I registered it about 2 years ago. It started as something to where I went around in my car and I just handed out meals to the homeless. But in the long run, I wanted it to be more because it started with me seeing the neighborhood that I grew up in and how it's basically nothing now. Like the school I went to is gone. The houses on the block are mostly gone. So I got it to where I wanted to slow steps. Started out feeding people, but it was more of a connection to the community and its people. Because I see Detroit changing so much, especially in like the downtown areas, but the inner city parts are kind of forgotten. There's not many houses, there aren't many jobs of that nature. So my initiative was to create houses, like rehab people. I heard about, like, I know they.
So can we get to the question though? No.
Is this something that we could see as necessary? From hearing a few of the things that you've said today alone, it shows me that it's possible. But my point is to give families something for the children so that those generations don't see and experience those same patterns and behaviors that get people that into the criminal system or on drugs of that nature.
All right. I think she's inspired by your story and urging the next generation to do more, and of course this prison pipeline.
Yes, I think that what you're doing is great. I think that we need more people like you out there, and what you're doing has an effect on a small scale, but we really need to be addressing it systemically on a far grander scale. You mentioned you have an idea about housing. Great. I think that's great. We have so many people who are homeless and living on streets now. So I hope that you can build this dream, and I hope that you can get some funding for this dream, because that's where it starts. It starts with a dream, just like that, and can develop into a huge nonprofit that does provide the kind of services that you have in mind to do. So I would encourage you.
All right, let's take 3 more questions. And I would prefer, let me invoke the moderator's privilege. I will prefer more questions than editorials. All right.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Fisher-Alexander here at the college. To make it brief, what are your thoughts on life prison terms, specifically for juveniles?
Oh, I'm opposed to them. I think that there is so much data evidence that the juvenile brain is not even formed to the point where it is able to make the kinds of judgments that need to be made in order to be a productive adult. And so to put someone away when they're 16, 17 years old for life, when they are still children, I think it's simply a crime. I think that attention needs to be given to life sentences generally, even for adults, and whether they are what we should be doing if the end goal is to put people back into society where they can function. If our goal is just to warehouse people, then life sentences make perfect sense. But we have so many people who are locked up and who have been taken away from their families and kids. And so this cycle that we see is simply going to continue. I'm opposed to life sentences for juveniles.
Great question. Let's go to 2 more questions, please.
Hi, thank you for being there. I'm at your level, which is obviously very high up. Are there any conversations around paying jurors a livable wage? And do you think this is a factor that's enabling white majority jury pools?
Great question. We certainly have talked about the abysmal pay that we give to people who serve on juries. And I think another reason why we have a number of minorities who are trying to duck out of jury service is because they're already in low-paying jobs, and they are with employers who do not continue their pay during jury service. A number of professionals are with employers who will pay them if they're out for a week or if they're out for 2 weeks. A lot of minorities can't do that. We talked about that's above my pay. You talk about my pay grade. That's way above my pay grade to try to get a raise for a jurors. It is. I think it's something whose time has come, and I do think that I would love to see a provision in the law that would require employers to continue the pay for people who are on jury service.
All right, let's take the final question.
Good morning.
Today. I just had a question when you touched on when you felt torn in between the Black movement and the movement for women. So I was wondering, have you seen an expansion, not just for Black women in the judicial system, but women of different cultures, Hispanic women, women of Asian culture, the Arabic culture, because just from my view, I feel like it hasn't really expanded that much. I'm super ecstatic that it's expanding for women of color, especially Black women. But I feel like it's a little bit of a slower process for especially Hispanic women. I was super excited when I seen Sotomayor, going to the Supreme Court. And I just feel like there's a lack for that. So just overall, have you seen any growth in that, especially here in Michigan, or just overall in the judicial system for women of color and women of different culture?
Thank you for that question. I think that things are starting to change. I don't have any statistics, but I do keep track somewhat of some of the first nominations to the bench that are happening now. And yes, we are seeing many more Asian people of Asian descent being appointed to the bench. My appointment, Shalina Kumar, is of East Indian descent, and I think that she is the first on our bench. There is a very active Arab population in the Detroit community who really would like to see a judge on our bench, and of Arab descent, that's coming. So I think that there are some gains being made. There is improvement. It is happening.
All right, we're down to, Judge, we're almost a few minutes after the time that we agreed to have this conversation. We don't want you to issue any ruling for that. But let me ask you this, the final question coming from me, and that is, it's tied around criminal justice reform and the Black Lives Matter movement. Many on the other side who are on the streets calling for reform see the system of jurisprudence, which you represent, as somewhat of an impediment to progress. They think that the system is all baked in, and that in fact we can never, get justice for Black people. You're a Black woman, unless and until we deconstruct the system and rebuild the system and so forth. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. For those who say the system is an impediment, and you are a part of the system, you represent the system of jurisprudence at the highest levels.
I'm not in favor. I think that there certainly is improvement that can be made. I'm not in favor of deconstructing this judicial system as I know it. I think that it really can work. I think that it has worked. I think that we have seen some major cases in the area of civil rights that have led to improvements for all of us. I'm not in favor of police departments being dismantled. I think that that was really a wrong tactic that was taken when people started talking about defunding police departments. I think that's nonsense. Police departments are needed. They are who we call when we're in trouble. And we should be able to rely on being able to make those phone calls and getting responses from our police departments. I think that there are some improvements that need to be made. Dr. Anderson had a question about mental health and how we handle that in the criminal justice system. I think that more attention should be paid to having people working for police departments who are trained in handling people with mental health issues. But improvements, yes. Deconstruction, not at all. Defunding, not at all.
All right, let's give a round of applause to the Honorable Victoria Roberts for taking us on a historical excursion into her life in terms of how her contributions have been able to shape the judiciary, her role, and her influence. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks to the college and Dr. Curtis Ivory, the Chancellor.